She is a gifted teacher and researcher. She's a professor at the University of Idaho. You can see she's part of the Department of Forest, Rangeland, and Fire Sciences. And she's very active out in the field, taking her students on field trips, doing field research. And she integrates all of those things. She works in aspen, she works in sagebrush and juniper, and she works on fire at individual plant to landscape scales. So this topic of diversity is really important. And it's something that she talks about in her classes. I appreciate Eva because she's always so kind. She's very active on the Phillips Farm Board and working on management of Palouse prairie remnants and gardening with native plants, among many other things. And one of those other things is she's very dedicated to diversity. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Eva. And again, please mute your mics and your video, except for Eva. We'll let you have yours.
Oh, thank you. You can still hear me? Yes. Thank you very much for that introduction. And let's see here if I can move forward. Let's see if I can just click here. There we go. So thanks again to the board of INPS for inviting me to give this presentation tonight. It's great to be able to do this over Zoom. I think we can reach more people that way. And I hope everybody will enjoy these Zoom meetings that we might have to have for a while. So the title of my talk is All You Ever Wanted to Know About Diversity, but Were Afraid to Ask. Because diversity is a topic that I have become over the years very interested in. And it's a key concept in all ecological studies. So it's a very broad concept. And of course, it applies to the native plants that we're all very interested in and the plant communities where those native plants grow. So I'll begin taking a step back from just diversity to the term biological diversity or biodiversity, which is a very broad term. So biodiversity is really the variety of all forms of life and the processes that keeps the ecosystems functioning. It's the variety of all living organisms, the genetic differences among those organisms, the communities and ecosystems in which they occur. So this is a huge concept. It's an all-encompassing concept. And obviously it's very difficult to quantify. But why do people care about biodiversity? Three different views have been identified. The first view is the functional view, that the interest in trying to understand how these ecosystems operate. The second view is the utilitarian view, how these ecosystems can provide for us, for humans, how they can provide ecosystem services, commodities, recreational opportunities, aesthetics, and things that we care about. And the third view is an ethical view, the idea that we don't have the right to allow species or ecosystems to go extinct. And I think if we think about this for each one of us and the way that we think about biodiversity, we have a little bit of each one of these views in ourselves. At least I do, for sure. So species diversity, we'll kind of zoom in a little bit from this broad, maybe unidentifiable concept of biodiversity to look at species diversity within the plant communities. As lovers of native plants, we're all interested in plant communities. And the question that I will pose here, or that I will talk about for a bit, is how can we quantify the differences in diversity within plant communities? And if you look at these two pictures, you have one to the left of a canyon grassland. This was taken down on Craig Mountain in the spring when all the flowers were blooming. And you can see the Snake River there in the background. It's just a gorgeous place. And And on the right, we have pasture grasses. That probably is an old field that was reseeded to pasture grasses for conservation reserve program purposes or something else. And just looking at these two pictures, obviously there is a difference in diversity. Even if we haven't even defined diversity at this time, you can see that there is a big difference. You can see it with your own eyes. So what I'm going to go through here is, well, how can we quantify this difference in a kind of in a numerical way and compare different plant communities? So to do this, different diversity indices have been developed to for both the variation in the number of species and the distribution of abundance among those species. And all these different indices, and there's lots of them, there's 50, maybe 100 of diversity indices that have been developed. They all include two components, and that is the richness and the equitability of abundance. So look at these two terms. I'm probably going to say them a few times while during this talk, especially in the beginning when we're trying to identify what these diversity indices are. So with regards to a plant community then, what would we mean by richness? And what would we mean by abundance? So within a plant community, richness refers to the number of species in the plant community. So how many species are there? How much blue bunch wheatgrass is there? How much arrowleaf balsam root? How many is the blue bunch wheatgrass there? Is the arrowleaf balsam root there? So how many of them are there? And the abundance is how much of each one there is. And there are different ways to measure that. You can measure the density, the number of plants, you can measure cover, maybe using transects or some other way, or you can look at how much biomass there is of them. So richness and abundance, remember those two things. So I'm going to give kind of a quick example here, just a super easy kind of Alice in Wonderland pictures here of plants, looking at what we mean by this richness and abundance. So we have an area, doesn't really matter how big it is, and we have 3 different species. So we have the pink, the blue, and the yellow. And so what do we mean by richness and abundance in this case? Well, we can simply compute that. Richness is pretty obvious. We have 3 different species. We have pink, blue, and yellow. And abundance is simply, in this case, we're going to use density. So we have 7 of the pink plants, 5 of the blue, and 2 of the yellow. And all of together, we have 14 different individuals. So then we can go into one of these diversity indices. And I'm just going to use this Shannon-Weiner diversity index as an example, since it's maybe the most commonly used diversity index. And the formula up here looks like kind of a mathematical nightmare possibly, but it's actually not that difficult to calculate diversity. And I'll go through that once and then more give examples of how we can use this concept. So the index is using these 2 terms. We have S, which is the richness, and P, which is this equitability of abundance that we were looking at. This index ranges from 0 to infinity, which is a very large number, but usually it doesn't go above 8. The values increase as the diversity increases, and it's more sensitive to rare species than other diversity indices are. So let's compute that diversity index for this very simple landscape. We already figured out what the richness is, and what is this equity, or what is the proportional abundance that we need to have to calculate the diversity. Well, the proportional abundance is just how many of these, for the pink flowers, we had 7 of them out of 14. So 7 out of 14 is 0.5. For the blue ones, we had 5 out of 14 is 0.36. And for the blue ones, we had 2 over 14 is 0.14. So that's the proportional abundance of those. And we can see that we had most of the pink flowers, so that has the highest number. So then we can just take this formula, this sigma sign means that we're summing up the proportional abundance for each one of the 3 species. And we can plug this in. Here we have our 0.5, our 0.36, and our 0.14. And we can calculate using Excel. I always use Excel, or you can use a calculator to come up with a number for the diversity index, which in this case is 0.990. There are other indices, and I'm not really going to go through them, just give an example of another one that's called the modified Simpson index. The only thing I really want to point out here is that it has the same 2 inputs. It has the species richness, the number of species in the community, and this proportional abundance of each one of the species. So those are the 2 inputs that goes into calculation of all these indices. It's just the mathematics is different depending on how you do that. So this particular index ranges from 0 to 1. As diversity increases, it gets closer to 1. As diversity decreases, it gets closer to 0, and it's less sensitive than the Shannon's index to rare species. So if you're interested in rare species, it's better to use the Shannon-Wiener diversity index than this one. All right, so let's do another example. Let's actually go in to calculate diversity for these, the Canyon Grassland and the pasture grassland that I showed pictures of in the beginning. So here we have the Canyon Grasslands, or could be Palouse Prairie for that matter. I'm only going to use 5 species. We might have a lot more species in there, but just for simplification, I'll just use 5. So we have blue bunch wheatgrass, we have Idaho fescue, we have sandbur bluegrass, we have some arrowleaf balsam root, and we have prairie smoke. And we've gone out and measured how much is there of each one of these. So we have a measure of foliar cover. So we have the most abundant species is the blue bunch wheatgrass, and the least abundant is the prairie smoke. And if you add up the foliar cover, it'll add up to 75 because there might be some bare ground, some ground that's covered by litter or rocks and not covered by plants. So then we can take this plant community and calculate the diversity for it, and we'll just use our by now familiar formula. So again, using Excel is just the best way to do this. So we have the covers. We can calculate that proportional abundance, which is just the cover divided by the total. And then in the formula, we use also the log for that proportion. And this index was actually calculated to identify diversity in text strings. So information theory is what it actually came from. And then we can sum up these proportional abundances for each species and come up with an index of 0.14. So that's for the Canyon Grassland example. So let's move on to the pasture grassland. So here is my pasture grass. Somebody has gone out and measured all the cover measurements in this pasture grass community. And we have a lot of smooth brome because that's probably what was seeded into this area after it was taken out of production or seeded into a pasture. So the cover there for smooth brome is really high. It's 81% of the area is covered by the smooth brome, but we have a little bit of meadow foxtail. We have a little bit of invasive annual grass there, ventinata, which is coming into a lot of places here in Latah County and maybe all over Idaho. we have a little bit of prickly lettuce, and we have some Western yarrow. And we might have some other things, but for this example, I'm just using 5 species. And we can do the same thing. We can calculate that proportional abundance and come up with our diversity index, which in this case then is 0.55. So quite a bit lower, as you would expect, than the Canyon Grasslands. One more thing that I would like to point out is if you look at, let's get back to our Alice in Wonderland plant communities. These two communities look quite similar, but they're also different. They're similar in the way that we have the same number of pink flowers. We have 7 in each. We have 5 blue. We have 2 yellow, but they're placed in different places. So which one of these plant communities then has the highest diversity? It's kind of a trick question. Actually, they have exactly the same because there's the same richness, there's the same proportional abundance. The only thing that's different is that these species are placed in different places. So the diversity is the same. I just wanted to illustrate that these indices don't account for placement, location, pattern, fragmentation, or anything like that. Okay, so we've kind of gone through how you can apply or quantify diversity within plant communities. But what about entire landscapes? Here we're looking at a landscape in southern Idaho, so I'm glad we have some participants from Boise and from southern Idaho that might be familiar with these sagebrush, steppe, and juniper woodland landscapes. And some of those people up here have been, are very familiar with them as well. This picture was taken by Steve Bunting, who has done a lot of research in this area, who I have had the pleasure to work with through time. And we can see the sagebrush patches. We can see some juniper patches in the background, maybe more dense juniper patches. So how can we quantify diversity for this across these landscapes? So maybe take a step back there again. Landscape diversity, why do we even have these patches across the landscape? Well, landscape diversity results from 2 superimposed influences. Number 1 is the pattern that's dictated by environmental conditions and limiting factors such as precipitation or temperature or soil types, things like that, geology. And the second influence is the pattern that's created by disturbances such as fire, grazing, hurricanes, you name it, that's altering the landscape. And then the recovery then that's following after these disturbances. So this is a picture again from Steve Bunting. It's a picture of a juniper woodland where a wildfire occurred in the foreground of this photo 75 years ago. And you can see this stark difference between the foreground and the background. In the foreground, you have much more sagebrush and small juniper. In the background, you have an other community type. Basically, you have these, or successional stage type anyway. You have this older Western juniper stand near the rim. So that's the influence that disturbance can create. And these landscapes are often represented by maps. This is a map of one of these kind of juniper sagebrush woodlands. You can see different types, often different types in the maps are illustrated by different colors, but you can also see the individual patches of how big they are and where they are on the landscape. So, question then, can we apply this diversity index idea to landscapes as well? And the answer is yes. And we're still working with the same components. We're still working with richness. We're still working with equitability of abundance. But in the landscape then, what is richness? What does richness refer to? And what does abundance refer to? So for a landscape, the number of cover types, so basically the number of colors in that map, is the richness. And the abundance then is the area of each one of those cover types. So same index, same idea, just the little bit of how we identify that richness and abundance. And we can go through the index that we're very familiar with, even for landscapes, and I'll show examples here to illustrate how this might work. So when these indices are applied to landscapes, they are a measure of that's related to the different cover types or polygon types, if you so will, and not species. So we're looking at land cover types, not species. So we'll take a landscape for an example. So here we have a landscape that's 100 hectares in size, and we can use this idea of calculating diversity to figure out which one of these landscapes has the highest diversity. In this case, we have 6 different plant communities. We have a grassland, we have a shrub steppe, we have a shrub steppe with juniper, we have an old growth juniper, and we have an aspen woodland, and we have a riparian type. So we have some different community types. And we have 4 different landscapes. And the question here is, well, which one of these landscapes has the higher diversity? And for the grass, just as an example, for grassland, we have 500 out of the 1,000 hectares is in grass. For landscape A, there's 200 hectares in shrub steppe for landscape A, and so on. So if you look at landscape A, you can see a couple of things, that it only has 4 of the cover types, or the community types. It doesn't have any aspen or riparian. For landscape B, is a little bit more even. It doesn't have such stark differences between grass and old juniper, for example. It has a little less grass, a little more juniper. So it's a little more even in the distribution of community types. C is totally even. It has the same amount of grass, shrub with juniper, and old juniper, equal, divided in 4 basically. And then we have this landscape D, which is very similar to A. You can see the first 2 types are exactly the same. Shrub steppes a little bit less, old growth juniper exactly the same. And then it has a little tiny bit of aspen woodland and some riparian area. So the question then is, well, which one of these is more diverse? And I'll give you 5 seconds to think about that, and then we'll talk about it. So looking at these again, I posed this question to a few groups in the past, and most say that, well, landscape D is more diverse. And it is true that it has the highest richness because it has all 6 cover types instead of just 4 like A, B, and C. But if you calculate the diversity indices, remember the diversity index accounts for both richness and this equity of abundance. You will come up with these numbers, and I won't bother going through the math, but for A, we come up with a 1.221, and these are the values that we come up with for A, B, C, and D. And what you can see is that you have an increase from A to B to C remember the richness was exactly the same. We had the same number of patch types for the first three landscapes, but it was a more uniform distribution in C. So when you have richness constant, the diversity will be increasing the more uniform the distribution is. You can also note that the diversity for D is higher than A, even though they had very similar abundances. There were a couple of more cover types in D, which results in this higher diversity. So both richness and equity of abundance contributes to the higher diversity. Anyway, one more trick question here. If we consider these two boxes as landscapes, we have the colors refer to different vegetation types or cover types. Which one has the highest diversity with respect to the cover types? And again, if you take the time to actually count up all these boxes, you'll see that both of them have the same amount of boxes of each, or pixels of each cover type. There's 5 black ones, there's 5 yellow, there's 5 red, 5 green, 5 white. So the diversity is actually exactly the same. So again, these diversity indices don't tell you anything about the placement of cover types. They just tell you about how much there is and how many there are. Okay, so let's get back to the Great Basin and talk about some land cover types in the Oahe Mountains. So let's give an example, actually from Steve Bunting's research, looking at 6 different cover types. So we have a grassland type after fire. We have a mountain big sagebrush type. We have a initiation juniper type. We have an open young juniper type where the ecological processes between juniper and sagebrush vegetation are kind of co-dominant. And we have a young multi-story juniper where really a lot of the sagebrush vegetation has been displaced by the juniper, and we have an old mature juniper woodland. And if we look at these landscapes and what Steve did, he went out there and spent many weeks to lay out transect to figure out what the richness was of these vascular plants in the area. And what he found was that the number of species, so the species richness across all these different types, the grass, the shrub, the juniper types, the mature juniper woodlands, was about the same. It was about 26 to 32 species in each one of them. There wasn't very much change. But across all the stages, the number of species was about 150, so a lot more than in each one of them. And the conclusions you can draw from a study like that is that all these successional stages from grass to old trees support different plant species. And to maintain all these stages increases the richness and diversity of vascular plant across that entire landscape. So each one of these landscape components are important for maximizing diversity across that landscape. Okay, so what about habitat? We've talked about plant communities, we've talked about landscape diversity, but what about habitat? Maybe look at some other organisms. So let's say that we have 4 different habitat types, pretty similar to the last one actually. We have a kind of a grass herbaceous type, we have a shrub steppe, we have a shrub steppe with juniper, and we have an old juniper habitat. And in this habitat, this is a study from Rick Miller and others, who was a professor emeritus from Oregon State, in a study where they looked at, well, how do birds use these different habitats? And they looked at these 5 birds amongst others. We have the red-breasted nuthatch. We have the horned lark. You can see those little horns up there sticking up. They looked at the Townsend solitaire sitting there on a juniper twig with a juniper berry, or I guess it's technically a cone in its mouth. We have the sage sparrow posing on a sagebrush twig, and we have the mountain bluebird. They did sample a lot of other species as well, but for simplification, I'll just use these 5 birds. So now we can look at the birds within these habitats too. So what Rick Miller and others did, they looked at, well, how many birds are there in all these different habitats, and what might that tell us about the diversity and the importance of these habitats? So you can again use your Excel spreadsheet, which is a wonderful tool, and look at, well, how many birds were there in the grassland, shrubland, juniper, and old growth juniper woodland? And for some of them, there were none. For example, the red-breasted nuthatch didn't occur at all in the grasslands, and neither did the Townsend solitaire. And so they set this up in the spreadsheet. And given this kind of information, then you can look at, well, which habitat has the highest total abundance of the bird species? What's the species richness for each habitat in the total landscape? Which habitat has the highest diversity? And we'll use the Shannon Diversity Index for this example. And which one has the lowest? And what conclusions can we draw related to habitat conservation of these bird species based on the calculations and observations that we've made? So again, we can use the tools that we have. We can use our richness and our diversities to put some numbers to this, and we can see that for the total abundance, I just kind of summed up how many birds total there were for each habitat, and the shrub steppe ended up having the highest in this example. And of course, if you sum all the birds up, you have the very highest number. If you look at the richness, it's really just the number of bird species in each habitat. It turns out the grassland and old growth both had 3, because there were some birds missing in each one of them that didn't use that kind of habitat, which is maybe not surprising since they are really quite different, the grassland and old growth juniper, which would probably attract more cavity nesters. But we can also calculate these diversity indices, and for each habitat, we can make that calculation. If you look at the 4 habitats, turns out that the shrub steppe ended up having the highest, but the point maybe to make here is that if you look at all the habitats together, you get a much higher diversity than if you look at each individual habitat. And for the conclusions you could draw related to conservation of these bird species, this kind of group of birds, is that all habitats would be necessary to maintain, to have the diversity of birds that we're looking at. Another example of diversity comes from the Great Plains, where we're looking at a grazing gradient. So we're looking at cattle grazing from very heavy grazing to moderate, through light, to no grazing at all. And this couple of researchers, Simpson and Knopf, looked at, well, how do birds use these habitats? Do they use them differently? Are there different birds that use the heavily grazed versus the not grazed? And indeed, they did find that this diversity in grazing, along that grazing gradient, different species, different bird species used those habitats in a different way. So we had a certain bird species were more likely to use the very heavy to heavy grazed areas, while others were using the light to no grazed areas. So to having that gradient actually made the diversity higher across the entire landscape. So trying to tie this back together, I started off talking about this very broad and kind of nebulous, unidentifiable concept of biodiversity. But just a few days ago, I actually found this paper that has this researcher that had tried to quantify the larger concept of biodiversity. And they had been looking at how does the effect of richness of grass species in grasslands impact diversity of all kinds of different organisms and processes. Big question. And what they found was that 45% of ecosystem processes measured were affected by the plant species richness in these grasslands. Plant richness increased richness of pollinators, herbivores, omnivores, carnivores, and you can see that in this graph A, where you have the plant species richness on the x-axis, and then you have an increase of pretty much all other different types of organisms. And the graph A here shows the above ground organisms. The only thing that decreased as plant species richness increased was the invaders, so invasive species, which is usually what we want. We don't want invasive species. Below ground processes kind of had a similar trend. We had the more plant species you had, the more grass species you had in the grassland, the more higher abundance of organisms and richness you had of below ground organisms and processes as well. And plant richness strongly increased carbon storage, less effect on nitrogen. And the final conclusion they had was that more research is needed to understand these mechanisms, and that's usually the end of most research papers. We're never done. So one thing that I kind of wanted to point out, I thought this below ground processes result was really interesting. And I've always been fascinated by this poster that was published by NRCS, I think, looking at the diversity in root depth of plants. And we're back on the sagebrush steppe here. And you can see a ruler here on the left where we have the depth of the roots of different species. We have the sagebrush itself, which goes down to past 6 feet, really deep roots. We have some of the perennial grasses. Maybe this is a squirrel tail, might have some sandburg bluegrass with more shallow roots. We have a lupin maybe, and some other grass species. And just this diversity in roots, root depths really increases carbon storage and the diversity of soil organisms as well. They did put a comparison of an invasive annual grass here at the very right side. And you can imagine if all these diverse sagebrush steppe species were replaced by this invasive annual grass, we wouldn't have much carbon storage. We wouldn't have the diversity of species, either above ground or below ground, that we have in the more intact sagebrush steppe. So keeping the diversity of the species in the steppe really supports wildlife, improves soil health, resistance to invasion of invasive species, the rebound from wildfires quicker, builds more drought resilience, and also sustains the people that rely on these landscapes. So it's one of my favorite posters. So to summarize, sum up here and give you guys a chance to ask some questions, just a summary of these diversity indices. They can be a useful measure of change through time in plant communities or communities in general, or landscapes. Care must be taken when using diversity indices to compare between communities or landscapes. Some communities or landscapes are just more naturally diverse than others. Remember that all information related to individual species or landscape patches is lost from these calculations. Diversity indices do not account for location or configuration of species or landscape patches. And diversity is often, but not necessarily, related to resistance to invasion by exotic species. There has been studies showing it both ways for different instances, probably one of those different mechanisms that we still need to study. And just because a community has a low species diversity doesn't mean that it's not important in the landscape. And finally, I just would like to point out that I've been talking about plant communities, landscapes, a little bit touching upon birds, but this concept of diversity really applies across disciplines. We hear on the news every day about cultural and ethnic diversity. We see information about diverse diets. We have these food triangles and food wheels, will you not, that encourages us to eat a diverse, different kinds of foods. Marketing, we see diversity in flavors. I have a little ice cream cones here, but that applies to soda pop, cereal, you name it. And increased diversity in flavors supposedly will increase the number of people that might be attracted to those products. Diversity, if you are retired or thinking about retirement, a diversified portfolio economically might be something that you're thinking about. Diversity applies to that as well. And finally, diversity in communities, in our communities, to have diversified economies to be more resilient in case one of those economies wouldn't pan out, so to speak. So the concept of diversity applies across a lot of disciplines. And one question that I've been kind of wondering over preparing this talk, why have I become so fascinated by this topic of diversity? And it's probably the idea that, can there really be too much diversity? I've come to the conclusion that the more diversity you have, the more diversity you get. So it's one of those kind of concepts that just the more you have, the more it gives. So I will leave you with that thought. And at that point, I think Penny is summarizing questions for me, and I'll be happy to answer questions. I put my email up there in case anybody would like to email after the talk. Thank you for inviting me again.
Thank you, Eva. That was fascinating. More about diversity than I ever knew. So thank you for that. All of you, try going down to your reactions and putting up a hand clap. Let's see if that works. Thank you for that. I do have some questions, but first of all, I'm asking everybody to put their questions in the chat. And one of the first ones says, does species diversity within plant community confer increased resilience to natural disasters and other disturbances?
That is a very good question. I think many studies have shown that is the case, that the more diversity you have, the more ecological niches are covered by those species, and the less likely you are to have invasion by, you're less likely to have an open niche that can be filled by an exotic species of some kind. So most studies have shown that. There are, of course, species like ventinata that is a tricky one because it seems to be able to invade plant communities that are diverse and have a diverse root system, and an annual grass that can even come into established perennial grasses. And we're still, Tim Prather at the University of Idaho is really trying to study the mechanisms of how that works. So in most cases, yes, I would say that diversity really decreases the possibility for invasion, but there are still instances where that is not the case. There's always an exception in ecology.
Okay, another question would be, I thought your bird habitat was a really interesting, what trends do you see going on in those Owyhee landscapes? And do they, like in terms of landscape diversity of patches, and does that explain the changes we're seeing in the loss of songbirds?
Well, some birds, given the changes we see, and lately we've seen more expansion of juniper, but now with more fire, maybe that will be pushed back. So there is kind of this tug of war between juniper expansion and the fires that we see. So definitely there are different bird communities that use those early successional stages and that use the older stages. And people have actually become more kind of concerned about the older stages of juniper these days because we're starting to lose them. And in the pinyon juniper woodlands, for example, the pinyon jay is one bird that has become more of a concern that never maybe was thought about so much before. But to try to keep all the stages on the landscape would definitely maximize, or at least the research that I've seen would say that we would maximize bird diversity. Then we have the sagebrush steppe end, of course, with the sage grouse. You know, there are sagebrush obligates that cannot tolerate that juniper expands into the landscape. So there's always going to be winners and losers, and sometimes I guess we have a way to try to use management to see which species we would like to benefit, and sometimes maybe natural disturbance will take care of that for us.
Charlotte, you could unmute and ask the question. I'm not sure I understand your question.
So my question is, you showed two images of the same number of different species, one that was quite dispersed with all the species involved, and then one where different species were like congregated together, and that both of those had same diversity index.
Yeah.
But I wonder whether that is dependent upon the number of the size of the area that you include in that analysis.
Yeah, I will try to go back to that. I think, is this the graph that you were thinking about?
Yes.
Yes, definitely. It will, well, it actually will not depend on the size of the area. It will only depend on how many species there are in each one of the boxes.
Right, but suppose you increase both of these areas. Perhaps if you increase the size, there won't be such a clustering of species, is what I'm thinking.
Yes, that is correct. That is a dependence of scale that we don't really know what's outside of the box. But as long as there is the same number and the same proportion of them in each box. They will be the same regardless of how big the box is.
Okay.
And why would arrangement matter?
Oh, this is the question to me.
Yes. Yeah.
I think, well, arrangement would matter because especially maybe for habitats. So if you look more at how habitats are connected or not connected, that would very much matter if you have a large patch versus if you have many small patches. And of course, that's going to depend, that's going to impact dispersal mechanisms for species, how far seeds can fly, how far animals can move, how far weed species can move, how far the desirable species can move. So the distance is going to be important between how far apart, especially patches are. So of course, distance matters. And there are diversity indices that can account for placement as well, but I didn't get into those today. So there are indices that can calculate edge diversity, which would give you more of a measure of how patches are placed on the landscape. So there are approaches to try, but still tough to do.
Susan, you want to make your comment? Unmute your mic and.
Yes, as far as the mattering the arrangement, some pollinators, like native bees, love a large drift of one kind of flower because then that makes their gathering of pollen more efficient.
Yeah, those kinds of examples. That's a great example.
I have one more question, Eva. Does pyrodiversity, I hear this term, pyrodiversity, making more biodiversity. And I think by that people are talking about having more fires and more different kinds of fires. Does that make for a more diverse landscapes?
I would say yes. I've seen, there was a whole conference, I think, in Tucson last year about pyrodiversity. And several research papers had shown that variety in fire, in many different ways. So the kind of the severity of the fire, the size of the fire, the patchiness of the fire. So variety in the ways that fire interact with that landscape results in higher plant species diversity and also landscape diversity. So both landscape patch diversity and species diversity. And I worked on a project where we looked at burn severity and looked at species within the different burn severity classes. And when we counted all the classes together, we got the highest diversity for all the species together.
Okay. Well, thank you. I think our time is up. I think Eva would stay around for a few more minutes. If anybody has pressing questions, you could unmute your mics if you'd like to go ahead and ask questions.
Yeah, I'll put up my contact information in case somebody would like to email at some later point. That would be fine too. So I can maybe stop recording at this point.
Well, that was really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.